Okay guys, welcome to Mark Codes. What I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to talk you through getting started with Shopify and Remix. And what we're going to do is I'm going to tell you what you need to do to get started. We're going to create a demo app and we're actually going to work through the Shopify Remix tutorial. And I'm going to talk through some of the things and features that you have with Remix as we go through that process. So this isn't just following a tutorial. I'm going to explain a bit more about what goes on as we go through. So first things first, what you need to do is you need to have the Shopify CLI installed, and you also need to have a Shopify Partners account. So you can get a Shopify Partners account by going to partners.shopify.com and registering there. And then to install the CLI, you need to go to this page, which I'll link below. This is shopify.dev/docs/apps/tools/CLI. And this tells you what you need to have the CLI installed. So you need Node.js version 18 or later. You need to make sure you've got npm or yarn or pnpm installed. You need to make sure you've got Git installed, and you also need to be using Chrome or Firefox. And what I have found in using Safari, which I use a lot, is that actually Shopify doesn't work particularly well in that, especially when you're in the admin of a store. So we are going to use Chrome throughout this video. And this page talks you through installing the Shopify CLI. And if you want to check if you've got the Shopify CLI installed, you can type Shopify version in your terminal, and that will tell you if it's installed. So this says I currently got 3.5.0, but version 3.53.0 is available. So I am actually just going to run this command. So I've got the latest version. And what this is installing, what that means is it means you're going to have the latest version of the Create Remix app for Shopify when you do create a project, which we're going to do in a second. And there's lots of reasons that's important, in part because Shopify are making changes to this all of the time. It's only been around since June 2023. But it's also important because one of the things Shopify changed recently is some of the webhook behavior. So Shopify expect webhooks to return a 401 if they're unauthorized, and the package wasn't doing that by default. And Shopify fixed that recently. So that's why it's worth having a most important one. So if you run that command I've just done, it will talk you through starting an app, but I'm not going to do that for now. We're going to come to this tutorial. So if we go to the Shopify Remix tutorial, this tutorial is actually really good just for talking you through really getting started with Shopify and Remix. And what you're going to do is you end up building a QR code reader where you can select a product, choose where it links a customer to, whether that's to a product or to the checkout page, and then it'll create a QR code that people can scan and you can use to promote your store. Okay, so what we need to do to get started is we need to create an app. So we need to navigate in our terminal to a folder that we want to create this app in, and we're going to type npm init @shopify/app@latest, which just means we're going to get the latest version of this app. And we're going to call this QR codes. And we've got a choice here to get started with Remix or start adding your first extension. We're going to get started with Remix. And then you've got a choice as well between TypeScript and JavaScript. And I'm going to go with JavaScript. And this then takes a little while to get everything installed and set up for you. Okay, so once this is done, you've got a little success screen here and it says it's ready for you to build. You can go into that directory, you can run an extension if you want to, which I'm not going to do, and you can also run npm run dev, which we will do because I'm going to talk you through some of the stuff you get within this initial package. So I'm going to do cd QR codes. And that puts us in the directory, and I'm going to open this in my code editor. So I've got an extension that means I can just type code dot and that will open it in VS Code, which is my personal preference of coding application, although of course you might have your own. And there's a whole variety of things going on here to start with. You've got your usual things you see for Node projects, like your package JSON, you've got your Node modules. We've got a folder here called Prisma, which we'll come back to in a minute. We've got the public folder, and the folder we're going to spend a lot of time in is this app folder. Now, if you've used something like Next.js before, a lot of this will be very familiar, although it is tweaked very slightly within Remix. So you've got a roots folder up here, which you get by default, and then you get some different files as well. So you always get this shopify.server, and generally you don't need to do much in here. You might want to register some extra webhooks at some point, but generally you just leave this as it is. So we're not going to touch this during this video at all because we don't need to, but there's just a lot of really useful things in here, and we'll see this referenced throughout this video. So I'm going to close that. We've got our root.jsx, which is our kind of root file. And again, you won't actually edit this. This is just what creates the body of our application. And then we've got the entry server up here, which again, we're not going to worry about. And we've also got the DB server. And this just does a lot of the Prisma setup for us, which means when we want to interact with the database, it's really easy thanks to Prisma. And we'll see a bit more about database usage as we go on throughout this. And then we got this roots folder. And this roots folder has a few different files in it. We've got webhooks, which we're not going to use, but it's just worth mentioning. So this is what is used to respond to any webhooks that are called from our app. So for example, the app uninstalled webhook is what's called when a user removes your application in Shopify. And all this does here is it says await because it's asynchronous, DB, which comes from that database server, .session, which is the name of the table we want to access, and it says delete many where shop is identical to shop. And this is just shorthand, so this is actually meaning where shop is shop. But because we don't need both, we could just say where shop is shop. And that just removes it. And again, these are other ways you can handle webhooks. And we're not going to go through this in a video. This is just showing you some of this stuff you get out the box with the Shopify Remix template. And then we've got a few other things up here. And the best way to show you these other routes is going to be to actually get this project started. So now I'm in this folder in my terminal, I'm going to type npm run dev. And the first time you run this, you're going to see a variety of things. So it's telling me Prisma needs updating. I'm not going to worry about that for now. It says before proceeding, this project needs to be associated with an app. Do you want to create this project as a new app on Shopify? Which if you go into your Shopify partners account up here, this is my list of apps on the side here. I haven't got one for this project, so I actually do want to create it as a new app. So I'm going to hit yes. And I'm going to again keep the name as QR code, so I don't put anything in there at all, and hit return. And I'm going to add it onto my developer store, which is just for me to play around with. And do I want Shopify to automatically update my app URLs in order to create a preview experience? I'm going to say yes, because that's really useful, especially when you're working on this over multiple days. And what it's doing now is uploading the stuff. It's creating a local server which gets forwarded on thanks to Cloudflare Cloud. And this is done. So we've got a preview URL here, and we've also got a GraphQL. And you can just hit P. I'm just going to copy and paste this into my Chrome browser because I've got a few different browsers open at the moment. So what we can see here is we want to install this onto our demo store. So this is my developer store. So I'm going to hit install. And I'm just going to bring this next to here and go back into my Shopify partners and refresh. And I'm going to show you something I was talking about earlier. So if we click into this QR codes app, which is now here, what we can see is we can see where it is installed. But if we go into this app setup on the left-hand side here, now because Shopify apps can't be served from a local host, it uses something called Try Cloudflare to basically forward your local host onto here. It's similar to things like ngrok if you've used that in the past. And when we said about automatically updating URLs, basically every time you stop running npm run dev and you start it again, this URL changes. And that automatically updating URLs feature means that this changes along with all of these other places you can see this same URL in here. And there's a few other places in this settings page you can add URLs we're not going to talk about in this video at all. But you can see here we've got that, which is the actual URL of our app. So we've obviously got our application installed here, and I'll come back to that in a second, but we can also go to our application in a browser window. And what we've got here is a sort of landing page. So if you had a real production app, this would be the page that you could use to kind of advertise your app to the world. But if we go back into our editor here and go into the underscore index, we can see root.jsx. And here we can see things like a short heading about your app. So I'm going to put create product QR codes, and I'm going to hit save and go back here. and you'll see that this has updated. So let me tell you what's going on here. So this is the index root. Now the reason this is not called index and up in our roots folder is because Remix has a thing where you can basically override the templates that something generates by default. So the underscore means do not use the stuff that comes from root JSX, create something completely new. And then root is just the default. So that means this has absolutely nothing to do with the rest of our app. It doesn't use any of the Shopify kind of redirects or things. It just creates a simple form that you can use to add it to your store. So in production, you could use this to promote your shop. People could come here, put in my shop name myshopify.com and use that to log in and install your app, and it's a great kind of call to action. So this is a great page to have in a production app, but we're not going to do much with it. But what I will show you is one thing up here, and we've got something here called a loader. Now in Remix, a loader is something that is called on the server before the browser actually renders the page. And loaders are really useful, and we're going to use them throughout this tutorial because they're a way of getting data that you want for your page, but running that on the server. That means we can do things like make API requests and get data and things that we're going to want to show in our actual application page to the customer, but we don't have to worry about checking if this data is empty because we know that by the time our default function loads here, the loader will have run. So what we're doing here is we're creating a new URL and we're seeing if the user has filled in the form and kind of created this shop, and if they have, we're redirecting them to the kind of admin page so they can install it. And if they haven't filled in that form, what we're doing is returning some JSON that says show the form, and then it's a Boolean, and we're just going to say yeah. And that means when we come back to our app here, we've got this function from Remix called use loader data, which means it gets data from this loader. And we're grabbing the show form parameter, which we set here. And that means further on, we're saying if show form is true, we're going to show the form. And that's why all of this is wrapped in that conditional. And that's just a very simple introduction to kind of how Remix uses these loaders and how you can access loader data. So if you used this to grab a list of all your products, you could then grab those products here and know that they have loaded before your app starts. This means you don't have to use things like lots of effects and other things you might normally use in React in order to get data. So we're going to ignore the rest of this for now, but if we go back to the store here, this is where I've installed my QR codes app, and we've got some boilerplate that has been set up automatically as part of this Remix template. We've got a little button up here that says generate a product. We've got an additional page here, and we've got these kind of cards laid out. So if we look at this in our code editor, firstly, we've got this app.jsx file, and this has this kind of app provider with the API key. And again, what we're seeing here is another use of this loader function. And this is also where we're seeing our Shopify.server file that I said we use throughout this app. So Shopify.server has something called authenticate. And authenticate is used to check if we're actually in the admin and if the admin is authenticated. And if they are, we're grabbing the API key and sending that back. What we're doing then is we're creating a UI nav menu which puts something on this left-hand side here. So if I was to change additional page to additional other page, you see that this changes here. So this is how you can do some links on this sidebar in Shopify, because actually the rest of your app is embedded in an iframe. But Shopify does let us reach for other parts of the store if we want to. So what we can do next is we can go to app_index, and this is the page that we can see here. So that is this page here. And it's called app because it's using this app kind of template, and then _index means it's the root. And there's a whole variety of stuff going on here which we're not going to go into. Likewise, if we click onto additional page, we can click onto app.additional. Now this dot here is the same as using folders. So if you used Next.js before, you'll know that in Next.js you can create a folder called app and then a page called something like additional.jsx. In Remix we can do that, but actually the more succinct way of doing it is to use the full stop. So app.additional becomes app/additional, and we can see that in our root up here. So this is the name of our app here, and then this app/additional is part of our application. So this is the same as saying app/additional in this Cloudflare thing. And of course, this doesn't work because we're not logged in. And this comes from this app.jsx. So where we've got this loader at the top, we're saying await, authenticate, and that redirects the user to this auth login, which is this auth folder here and root. So that is what we're seeing here. And that just means users cannot access these internal pages of your application, such as this one, unless they are actually logged in and installed. So there are some other things in this Remix starter app, which I'm not going to go into for now because we're going to see them throughout. So what we're going to do is we're going to get started with this tutorial. So if we come back to this Remix tutorial, create an app, we've done that, install QR code. So this is a package that we're going to use to create the actual QR code. And to install that, we just need to copy this npm i QR code and run that in our app. So I'm going to clear this for now. So we're not running dev, and I'm going to type npm i QR code. Okay, so that's installed. So if we go back to our tutorial, we also need to install the Shopify Polaris icons. And we can click that to see the package for them. And there we get the install command as well. So we're going to also take this, we're going to copy that, go back to our terminal, and we're going to run that as well. So npm i at Shopify/Polaris icons. And these are little icons you can use throughout your app. And Polaris is the kind of Shopify design system. There's lots of components, and some of those components are things like these cards you can see here. And this is a way of creating an app that is consistent with the look of Shopify that people are used to, but also with your own stuff. And this is especially useful if you do want to create an app that looks like it is part of the Shopify dashboard, which obviously creates a much better user experience because it's an interface that people are used to. So we've installed our Shopify icons. So if we come back here, next we want to install Tiny Invariant. So we're going to grab this command again, go back to our terminal and stick that in. Okay, so that's all of the packages installed that we're going to need. So we can actually run our dev server again. So I'm going to type npm run dev. And as I said, each time this is run, you get a new URL for your application. So this old one up here, widescreen looks smart piano, won't work anymore. But if I go back here and refresh this page in my Shopify partners, you'll see that that URL has now changed because that is where my app now sits. Now, obviously in production, you deploy your app somewhere and this would be a permanent URL. However, for development, this is really useful, especially as the Shopify CLI updates these automatically. And that also means if I refresh this page in my Shopify store admin, this still works. So let's come back to our tutorial. So we've done all of this. So the first thing we're going to do is add the QR code data model. And this is done in your schema.prisma file. And I said I'd talk about schema.prisma as we go through. And if we click this here, which is our Prisma folder and schema.prisma, you can see there's already some data in here. So firstly, we've got a generator which creates the Prisma client. Secondly, we've got the database which sets up our database. So for us, this is just using an SQL-like database, and this will be locally stored. If you're going to run this in production, you might have a separate database server. This means in theory, you could host your database somewhere like MongoDB online, and also have your app deployed somewhere else, and they would just talk to each other. And then down here, we've got a database model. And this is for a database called session. And generally what you should do when you name your databases and create them in Prisma is keep them singular. So a session database can have lots of individual sessions. So if we go back to our tutorial, we're going to copy this QR code model. And what this is going to do in a minute is it's going to create a QR code table in our database. And that QR code table is going to have an ID. That's going to be an integer, and it's also going to auto increment. We're going to have a title, which is going to be a string, a shop, which is going to be a string, a load of other things that are also going to be strings. then we're going to have a scan, which is going to be an integer, and that's going to default to 0. And that's going to count the amount of times that the QR code has been scanned. And then we're also going to create a created at field. And this is going to be date time, and it's going to default to now. So we won't really have to worry about populating this because it'll automatically populate. And the same for this. When we first create an entry, it will default scans to 0. Now, if we look up a model table, you'll see that some of these actually have a question mark after them. This is because it is not required. So if you want a field to be required, you don't add a question mark. If it's an optional field, add a question mark. So we've added that into our table. So next, what we want to do is migrate our database. And that's because creating this alone merely sets up our database model. It doesn't actually do anything. And let me just talk you through this command. So we've got npm run Prisma, migrate dev, which are all commands for Prisma. And then at the end here, we've got something that says add QR code table. Now, add QR code table isn't a native Prisma command. It's a syntax where you add the name of your table in the middle. So if we were doing the same for session, this would be add session table. And it just needs to be all lowercase. Okay, so I'm going to hit return. And we can see that Prisma is applying this migration, and it says it's been created and applied, which is great because it means our database is now in sync. Now, if we want to actually view our database, Prisma has a studio built in. So we can copy this command from here and run this. And this will open automatically, and this allows you to view your Prisma database locally. So you can see we've got two models in our database. You might think of these as tables if you use kind of traditional databases like MySQL. And we can click into them. So if we click into session, we can see that session has an entry already, and that's from when we installed this in my developer store. So when we installed this here, we created this entry. So it's got the URL of my shop, it's got a state, whether I'm online, it's got any scopes, and we'll talk a bit about those later on as well. And then it's got access tokens as well. And we don't really need to worry about this session table. What we do want to worry about is this QR code table. And we can see that it's completely empty at the moment, but it has all of these headers that we just added. So you can see those here. So you've got ID, title, shop, product ID, ID, title, shop, product ID, etc. So adding new tables in Prisma is super easy. So let's get back to our tutorial. So we've done all this now. So next what we want to do is get QR code and product data. And what that basically means is we want all of the logic in order to actually get that data from the table into our application. So we're going to create a model to start with. So we're going to go into a folder called app/models, and we're going to create qrcode.server.js. So here we've got app. We don't currently have a models folder, so we're going to create that by right-clicking app and choosing this. And we're going to say models, and then it recommends we call it qrcode.server.js. And of course this is an empty file, but Shopify do give us a load of code to paste into it, which we will go through. So this is basically a series of functions that are going to help us access our database. So at the top here, we're importing something called QR code. We're importing invariant from Tiny Invariant, which we installed earlier, and we're importing db from db.server. And again, you won't ever need to touch db.server, but this is a helper that basically gets our Prisma client all set up and running. And then we've got a few different functions throughout here, which we're going to call throughout our app. So we've got a function here called getQRCode, which takes an ID and also GraphQL. And we'll talk a little bit more about the GraphQL later on, but it basically grabs the GraphQL client from your Shopify server. And all this does is it queries our database to find a QR code where the ID is equal to the ID we pass in here. And if you remember from earlier, saying just ID here is the same as saying ID is ID. but we can shorthand it in JavaScript. So this is an asynchronous function, and it says QR code is equal to await DB, which comes from our database client up here. And the way Prisma works is it creates functions per table. So db.qrcode references this QR code model. And it says .find first, which is a function from Prisma again, where we look for the first item that matches this. And then we have our query parameters here. So we're looking for where, and again, ID is ID. And then we're checking, we're saying, is there a QR code? If there's not, return null. Otherwise, we're going to run this function here called supplement QR code, and we're going to pass in the QR code and GraphQL. And this is another function that is within this file further down. So that's just down here. And what that does is, again, it looks for the QR code image, it does some GraphQL stuff with the Shopify GraphQL, and returns all of that kind of stuff. And we're not going to worry too much about the rest of this folder for now, because all of these functions are helper functions, and you'll see what they do throughout. So we've got functions like get the QR codes, which is obviously different from get QR codes. So this gets all of the QR codes for your shop. We've got get QR code images, which will get the QR code images. We've got get the destination URL, a whole variety of helper functions throughout this file, including things like validate QR code. And you'll see that pretty much all of the functions in here, with the exception of supplement QR code, export, which means we can access those in other files. So let's go back to our tutorial. So we've created the model, and what we've done is we have actually just copied all of this data here. And if you want to dive into this a bit more, it does tell you exactly what each function does. So we're not going to do that. Next, we're going to create the QR code form. And this will allow the app user to manage the QR codes. So we're going to set up a form root. So in app roots folder, we're going to create a new file called app.qrcodes. $id.jsx. I'm going to copy and paste this file name just so we don't make any mistakes. So if we click onto root and right click new file, we create that app.qrcodes.id.jsx. And this file name, as we've learned before, means /app/QR codes. And then we got this new thing here, $id. And this is a way of passing a variable into our root. So if we had an ID of 3, it would be /app/QR codes/3. And this $id is a way of passing something dynamic in. And we'll see how to access that in a second. So if we come back to our QR code again, what we're going to do is we're going to copy and paste all of this code from this file that's linked here. So I'm going to use this copy function. And this is quite a big file. And this is quite a big file, so let's talk about what's going on. So at the top here, we've got a load of things we're importing. So we're importing useState from React. We're importing some useful functions from Remix Run and Node, which is JSON, which kind of formats some stuff, and redirect, which will redirect a user. And then we're importing some other hooks from Remix Run and React. Use loader data, of course, we saw earlier. We're importing authenticate from Shopify.server, which is a way of making sure this user is definitely logged into the admin. Then we're importing a load of these Polaris components I was talking about. So these are ways of laying out your app nice and easily in a style that matches the Shopify admin. Then we're importing an image called image major from Polaris icons, which we installed earlier. We're importing this DB from db.server, which, if you remember, is our Prisma helper. And then from this model we just created, the qrcode.server, we're importing our getQRCode function and our validate QR code function. So if we start at the top here, we've got this asynchronous loader. If you remember from earlier, loaders in Remix, this is something we get automatically from Remix, something called loader. And we can put it into any page we like. So we can use it here, we don't have to call anything, it just exists. And this runs on the server before the actual component is displayed to the user. And what this loader does is it has a request and a params. And first things first, we're grabbing admin from await authenticate.admin and passing in the request. This authenticates the Shopify admin user. Next, we're checking our parameters that come into our loader. And we're saying if params.id is new, return this. So we're going to return a destination of product and a title of just an empty string. And then otherwise, we're going to grab the QR code. And I'll come back to this in a second. If you're wondering where we get this ID from, this comes from a dynamic route. So where we said app.qrcodes $ID, that means we have a parameter called ID. If we change this to $fish, this would be params.fish. So it's saying if this is new, we're going to return this object, which has just got destination of product and title of nothing. Otherwise, we're going to return some JSON, which is going to be a result of this get QR code function. Now, if you remember, this get QR code function comes from our qrcode.server file. And this expects an ID and GraphQL. So we're passing in here params.id, and we're making sure that becomes a number. And then we're also passing in admin.graphql. And this admin object we extracted from authenticate.admin with our request gives us a GraphQL client for this particular store. And this enables our QR code server to eventually use the GraphQL down here in this function in order to get the supplement QR code. So this all happens on our page load, and then it returns this, and we'll see this in action in a second. And then we also have another function we get from Remix called an action function. And again, this can be used in any Remix page we like. And once again, it gets request and it gets params. And this is doing something a little bit different. So this time we're getting the session from the authenticate.admin with our request, and then we're getting the shop name from the session. And then what we're doing is we're creating a data object. So we're saying our data object is going to include object.fromEntries, and that's coming from the form data. And form data is something we get with this action function. So if a user has submitted a form, we can use this to grab all of the fields in that form. And then we're also adding the shop onto it. And if you kind of been following along, you'll guess that this actually matches all of the data we're going to want in our model here. So this is going to have the ID, the shop, the product ID, and all of that kind of thing that we want. And then we've got a bit more going on here, and we'll see this in action shortly. So we're saying if data.action, so this is coming from form data, is delete, that means we've said at some point to this component we want to delete something. So we're saying await database, which is our Prisma helper, .qr code, which is what we get from the name of our table thanks to Prisma, .delete, which is another function not dissimilar to our db.findMany or find first that we've got up here. So we're saying db.qrcode.delete, and again we're passing in a query saying where ID is the same as params.id, and we're making sure that is cast as a number. So we're deleting it, and then we're returning a redirect. So once we've deleted this, we're just sending the user back to our app home. And then we've got some more logic that continues. So this logic will continue if we're not deleting something. So we've got a function called validate QR code, which again comes from our qrcode.server. So we can look at that function here. So validate QR code expects some data. It creates an empty errors object, and it says if there's no title, add this error. If there's no product ID, add this error. If there's no destination, add this error. And then we're saying if there are some errors, return errors. Which means when we come up here, we're saying errors is validate QR codes. If there are errors, so if errors, because remember this only returns errors if there are any, then we're going to return some JSON with these errors and a status of 422. And again, this is where this function would stop. However, if we get this far, that means we haven't got any errors and we're not deleting something. So we're saying here QR code is equal to one of two things. So we've got a ternary operator here. So we're saying if params.id is new, which means we're creating a new one, then we're going to await db.qrcode, so get our Prisma.create, which is another function we get from Prisma, and we're passing in the data. So this is going to create us a brand new entry in our database. Otherwise, we're going to say db.qrcode.update. So if we got here, we're not deleting something, we've not got any errors, we've already got an ID that's not new, so we must be wanting to update a QR code. And we're saying update it where ID is equal to this number. So this is our where check. And then as our second parameter to Prisma, we're passing in the data. So this is the data we want to update. And then once that's done, we are redirecting them to app QR codes /QRcode.id. So this will take them to this route that we're currently in. So that is our action function, which comes from Remix, and also our loader function, which comes from Remix. And then we come down to our usual React stuff. So this is our default function that renders our page. So let's have a quick look at what's going on here. So we've got const errors. So firstly, we're using action data, which is another hook we get from Remix. And we're looking for .errors. So we're saying if you use action data, and this can be null, it might not be there, .errors, or we're just saying an empty object. So errors will be a list of errors or an empty object. So our loader data up here will have either returned this empty object with new details or an existing one. So we grab that here using our loader data function. And then we're doing some use state stuff that you'll have seen in React before. So we've got, we're creating a variable called form state, and it has a setter called set form state. And by default, that is just going to be QR code. So that will either be an existing QR code, which we get from our loader data, or it will be a new one. Then we've got clean form state, set clean form state, and use state QR code. So again, this will set some of our form defaults. And then we've got is dirty is basically making sure that our form state is not the same as a clean form state. And these are just going to be used to set the status of buttons and things, so it's a more user-friendly experience. And then we're also creating something called navigate, which comes from a use navigate hook. And that is different from a use navigation hook. And then we've got an asynchronous function here called select product, which is used for our product picker. And this uses the window.shopify.resource picker object in order to get products. And again, this checks if there's products, and if there are, it grabs this data and it sets our form state accordingly. Then we're creating something called submit, which uses the use submit hook. And we've got a function here called handle save. So this will handle when the user hits the save button. And this creates a data object from our form data. It sets a clean form state to the form state. And then it uses the submit function from useSubmit and passes in the data and the method of post. And this means that within the same window, without the window reloading, our action function gets run. So this means on save, your data gets put together, the form state is set, and we submit. And all of this happens without re-rendering the page, thanks to this action function in Remix. And all of this will make a bit more sense when we see this running shortly. And then we've got our actual components get sent out. So this just creates our page layout, and we will go through this when we can see it shortly. So let's return to our tutorial. And this has talked through all of this. So if we return to our form tutorial, it talks you through all of those things I've just been through. So it talks about authenticating the user, return JSON response. And if you want to recap some of the stuff we've just looked at, so this is our resource picker, you can work your way through all of this to understand those chunks of code. So what we're going to do now is create our root component. So we actually already have this screen. So if I go to /apps, if I go /app, you can see we currently have an index component. And we're going to replace all of this with this next step. So we're going to app_index, we're going to copy this. I'll go to our file, and we've already got app._index, and we're just going to select all of this, delete that, and paste in that code we've just done. Now if I hit save and come back over here, you'll see that we now see this: create a unique QR code for your product, create QR code, and another button up here that says create QR code. So there's quite a lot going on in here as well. What we are seeing here is something called an empty state. So again, up here we have a loader. And remember, a loader runs before the page is actually rendered. So again, we are grabbing admin and session from authenticate.admin.request. And this is again, we've seen this before. This is a really helpful helper component that comes from that Shopify.server. And Shopify kind of set all of this up so we don't have to worry about all of that. Once that's done, because we're awaiting it, we're saying QR codes is get QR codes, session.shop, so passing in the shop name, and then we're passing in the admin.graphql. And this runs from our QR code.server. So this is the get QR codes, which is here. And this gets all of the QR codes. So it finds many where the shop is the shop name, and we order it by ID descending. And this function says if we haven't got any QR codes, return an empty array. Otherwise, promise to all QR codes.map and supplement QR code. So this is going to wait for all of these to run through this supplement QR code function. And we'll see what this does in a bit as well. So if we return to our app index file, we can see a few things going on up here. So firstly, we've got an empty QR code state constant, which receives something called onAction, and it creates something called an empty state. Now this is something called a Polaris component, and if you go to polaris.shopify.com, you can view all of the different components you can use with Polaris. And an empty state is a really good way of showing a big kind of you need to do something to your user when there is no data. So we've created an empty state component here that has a heading of create unique QR codes for your product, which if we go back here, we can see that here, that's the heading. We've got an action, which is create QR code, and on action is what happens when you press it. So we've passed that function in when we call this component, and I'll show you that in a minute. And then we've got this image, which is an empty state file. So this just comes from Shopify. And we've got a little p tag before we close our component. Next here, we've got a function called truncate. This is just used to make a string a bit smaller so we don't clog up a table. Next, we've got something called a QR code table. And the reason Shopify have set all of this up as lots of different kind of components is so we don't end up with one very long default component for this page. So you can see these aren't exports, they're not defaults, these are just things we're going to use within this page. And this uses something called an index table, which again is another Polaris component. And this has a resource name, so singular is QR code, plural is QR codes. The amount of items is how many QR codes there are. And then we've got some headings. So our headings, which will be for our table, are things like thumbnail, and that's hidden, title, product, date created, and scans. And then selectable is false, which means users cannot select these. And then what it does is it takes our QR codes, which we will have got from this QR code.server, where we're calling get QR codes, and it will map through them. And for each one, it will create a QR table row with a key of QR code.id and a QR code of the QR code data. And that leads us on to our QR code table row, which is obviously these. And these expect a QR code, and they create an index table.row, which again is another Polaris component with its ID. It's got a position, which orders it. And then we create a table cell, and the cell has a thumbnail. Now you'll know from up here, this thumbnail is actually hidden, so we don't actually show that, but we've got the data, so we put it here anyway. We then got a second cell, so if you picture these working along a table row. So these are our headings, and then this is populating each row. And we've got a link to it, and a truncated title. It just means if it's a really long title, it's just a bit shorter for user-friendly experience. And it links to QR codes / qrcode.id, and that will take them to this page here. So we don't need the app part of this route because we haven't got a / there. It'll just append this onto our URL, and we know this page is just / app. So this will take you to / QR codes / qrcode.id, which of course will allow them to edit that QR code in this page that we just created. Then we've got something here where we're saying, is the product deleted? So have we created a QR code to a product that doesn't exist anymore? And if so, we're warning the user this has been deleted. Otherwise, we're just showing the product title. And then here we're saying when it was created. So we're getting the QR code.created at and turning that into a date and to a date string. And then we got the amount of times it's been scanned. So then we come to our default component, which actually gets rendered. And you'll see we're grabbing QR codes from use loaded data. And if we come all the way up to our loader, if you remember, we got all of our QR codes from this get QR codes function. This means our index component down here will either get an empty array or a load of QR codes. And then we're also creating a navigate from use navigate. And this is used to navigate users in your app. Now, of course, you could create kind of your traditional href equals app QR codes, new, create new QR code. However, the href in Remix will obviously create a link that users follow, whereas navigate is really useful because it renders it without you actually having to change page. So this updates the navbar in the browser and updates the screen the user sees, but it doesn't actually refresh a page. This all happens within your application. This is why navigate is a much better way of navigating users than using your traditional href in Remix. So this is a button, it's got a variant of primary, and then on click, we're navigating there. And this is in the UI title bar component. And if we come back to our application, we can see you've got title of QR codes, which is the title here. And then we've got our create QR code button. And this is the title bar, which means this will always be here. So we've ended this UI title bar, and then we're creating a Polaris layout section. And we're creating a card, and we're saying if QR codes.length is 0, so if we have no QR codes, then we want to show this empty QR code state. And on action, which of course is a function our empty QR code state expects to receive, we're going to navigate the user. And then we're saying if there are already some QR codes, we're going to create our QR code table, and here are the QR codes. And of course, our QR code table is up here and expects some QR codes. So of course, at the moment, and we can check this in our Prisma Studio, we haven't got any QR codes, which means we see this empty state here. So let's continue with our tutorial. And again, Shopify talks you through all of this. So next, we're going to add a public QR code route. And this will be a route that anyone can access when they scan a QR code. So this is going to be a file called qrcodes.index.jsx. So in routes, we're going to right click and we'll type QR codes id.jsx. Now, again, because this doesn't follow the app or app.additional, this is just going to be your application URL /QR codes / the ID of the QR code you want to access. This also means this route is not going to inherit any of the stuff from app_index, which means you don't need to be authenticated to access this route. So again, we're going to copy this code and put this in. So again, at the top, we're getting in JSON from remix run/node, and the more you use remix, the more you're going to use this function. We're getting it invariant from tiny invariant, We're getting used loader data from remix run / react. And again, of course, that reacts to our loader. And then we're getting our DB from our server. We're importing this function, get QR code image, from our models and QR code server. You might not have seen this tilde used in root before. This basically just means the root of your app. So this will always go to the root of the app. Okay, so again, we've got load drop here. We've seen this loads of times, and again, it's asynchronous. And firstly, we're checking if there is an ID in our parameters. So if a user has just gone to / QR codes, we're going to pass this message back. And this uses the invariant function, which will check if we do have this ID. If we get here, ID is going to be equal to params.id. And then we're calling our find first function. And we're not actually using our QR code server here because we don't need to pass in GraphQL because we won't have access to GraphQL here. And if you remember, our QR code server get QR code expects GraphQL, which we're obviously not going to have here. So we're saying const QR code is await database.qrcode.find first, and we're looking for a QR code where the ID is equal to ID, if you remember the shorthand that we've talked about a few times. And then again, we use an invariant to check if this actually exists and passing in the QR code. And then finally, we are returning JSON with the title of QR code.title and image, which is await QR code image. And we are using our QR code server for this. So get QR code image expects an ID. And if we go into here, if we go into our QR code server and look for get QR code image, we can see a function here. And this is a really short function. It basically grabs the Shopify app URL and creates a new URL / QR codes / ID / scan. And then it returns that URL. And we'll see that in action again shortly. So by the time we get to our main function, we know that this exists. Otherwise, invariant would have thrown this error for us. So this will only get rendered if we've got to the end of here and pass something back. So again, we're using use loader data to extract our image and our title from the loader data. And then we're returning a H1 with the title and an image with the SRC of our QR code image and the QR code for a product. So if we come back to our application again, we are very near the end of this. And again, Shopify talks you through all of this. And then the final thing is going to redirect the customer to the destination URL. So we're going to create a new route called QR codes $ID scan. So QR codes $ID.scan.jsx. And again, this won't need authenticating because this isn't part of our authentication route. So we're going to copy this and paste this in here. And so again, we've seen this before. We're grabbing the redirect function from remix run / node, which is a way of redirecting our user's URL. We're grabbing invariant from tiny invariant, which is a way of checking we've actually got an ID in our parameters. And we're grabbing database from database.server, which is our Prisma database. And then we are grabbing get destination URL function from our QR code server. And I'll show you that again in a second. And then this time we're exporting the loader and we don't actually have a default component. That means this component isn't ever going to have anything it shows to the user on the front end. It's just going to do something when the page loads. So again, we're grabbing our parameters here. We're checking we have a parameter ID, and of course this ID comes from that $ID. So ideally we'll have a URL that's something like QR codes /1 / scan. And if there's no ID, we are just returning could not find a destination. If there is an ID, we're saying number, because we'll make sure it's a number, and passing in parameters ID, because parameters always get passed as strings, even if they are in fact a number. And then we're calling our database helper again. And we're saying await database, QR code database. So this is our table again. Find first where the ID is equal to our ID. And then we're checking this, and if that doesn't exist, we're returning this error to the user. And then finally, And then finally, we're going to do one more thing before we return this to the user. So if we've got to this page, the user has scanned a QR code and they're trying to get to this product. So we want to update our scans property in our database so that me as a shop owner, I can see how many times people have used my QR code. So we're saying await, and we're not assigning this to a variable because we don't need to, we just need to do this. So we're going to wait for database.qrcodetable.update, where the ID is ID and data scans. So we're looking into our data, we're looking for our scans property. So if we go back to our QR codes over here, we can see we've got scans, and we know scans is an integer. So we're saying in our data, scans is going to be incremented by 1. And because this is within our data object, this is the only part of our data we're going to update. And then finally, we're going to redirect the user to the URL, which is going to come back from get destination URL with the QR code. So let's have a quick look at get destination URL so you can see what's going on at this point. So this comes from our QR code.server, and get destination URL here checks if it is a product to start with, and that's because our QR code has a destination. And if it's a product, we'll get in the shop name, which again comes from our table. So if we look at this table in Prisma again, you'll see that each QR code has a shop. It also has a destination. So we're again saying if QR code.destination is a product, then we've got a QR code shop name /products /QR code product handle. And again, product handle comes from here. And that means we send the user to that URL. So if we get to this point, we know that it's not a product destination we're going to. So we're going to see if it's a variant. So we're using this regex here to match the variant ID. And if this doesn't exist, we're going to throw this error. If it does exist, we're going to return them to the cart with that variant inside the cart. This basically allows you to create a QR code that will add something to a basket and take a user straight to checkout. This is really useful for making sure there's not many clicks between a user scanning your QR code and actually being able to purchase a product on your site. So we're taking them again to qrcode.shop/cart this time, and then matching the first entry in that array and adding 1. So that :1 means we add 1 of those to the cart. So that is our get destination URL function. If we're just sending them to a product, we just do that. If we are going to add it to the basket and then send them to the checkout, we do that. And that is our scan function. So finally, let's go back to our Shopify app tutorial, which again talks you through all of this. And then finally, it says preview and test it, which means we're actually already running this still. So we can come back to our store. I can refresh this page just to make sure it's all up to date, although it does refresh in the background. And we can click create QR code, and then we see this form. Now we up here in our URL, we can see it's /app QR code /new. And that of course is this file here. So app QR codes ID, because remember at the top of here, in our loader, we are looking for params.id is new and then returning this new object. So this is a completely new one. So we're going to say scan me to buy. We're going to select a product, and this is our product picker. So this gets loaded again from here. So this is our select products. And I said we talk more about this component later. So if I look for select product, we can see this button that on click does that. And we check for errors. And if not, we do load this to the user. So I'm just going to click that and hit select. And then there we have it there. And that is because we are also checking if there is a product present and showing that. So we can look for that in here. And I do find with some of these bigger files, the easiest way to do this and to navigate through is just to search for what you're looking for. So we can see here, if our form state has a product ID, then we're putting out this button that says change product. Otherwise, we don't put anything out. And again, If our form state has a product ID, then we're creating an inline stack. Again, these are Polaris components, and it has a thumbnail and the product image, or a fallback image, which comes from the Polaris icons. It has an alt tag, which of course is good for screen readers. And then we've got text, which is as a span, and it has the product title. So in practice, if there is a product ID, then we're showing the product details here. If not, we're showing our select product. So if I come back here, I can change the product. I can't actually remove it. I think if this was going to be a permanent application, I'd want to add a remove button here as well. And then of course we've got our option here, link to product page or link to checkout page. And this is a choice list called scan destination, and it has a label with a value, and this is cart. And the default selected value is for destination that is in our form state. And then when we change it, we set the form state to include what's already in form state, but update destination to the picked choice. And of course, error will show an error if there's a destination error. And you'll remember this is something that gets checked when the data is submitted. Now you might be thinking, hang on, this is a set of radios, how can there be no error here? Or how can this never be populated? But of course a user could go into the inspector and try and mess around with it. So it's worth checking that this exists just in case. So once we've ticked that, we can just hit save. And you'll notice a little twirly thing in there. That's because at the bottom here, we have page actions, and it has a loading state if we are saving. And of course we set saving further up at the top as well. And again, the same goes for our delete button, which has a loading state as well. And on action, we submit an action of delete, which means if we go back to our action function, which is up here, if you remember this from earlier, we're saying if data.action is delete. And of course, that comes from here, because if we're deleting, we submit the form as a post request with an action of delete. And the reason we see these kind of loaders and spinners and things is because all of this happens within this frame without loading a page. This means if I hit delete or if I hit save, this refreshes within the same window. There's actually no reloading going on at all. And this is where the remix action and loader functions are really useful, because they do just run within the same page without actually physically refreshing a user's page. And then because we've saved it, we can see a QR code preview, and we can download that, or we can go to a public URL. And again, let's have a look at these in the code. So I'm going to just search for QR code, which is this bit here. And again, this has an empty state. So if there's no image, we just do that. But because we have got an image, we see the QR code image. And this is the 1/3 layout section. So you can see, obviously we've got the image, which is a QR code, which we can see here. Then we've got a button, which is disabled if there's no image. So this is not disabled because we have got an image. And the URL is the QR code.image. It's a download, which means that item will download rather than try and load it in a new window or something. And then it's a variant of primary, which gives it this color. And this again comes from Polaris styling. And then we've got a second button, which again is disabled if there's no QR code.id, which is this button here, of course. And then the URL is that, and that's our public URL. So we've got /, so it goes to the root of our app, and it's got a target of blank, so it opens in a new window, and it says go to public URL. So we can click that, opens a new window, and you can see the QR code there. Now, if we were to scan that, that would take us to QR code /1/scan. And if I do that, it takes me to this product in my development site. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to click QR codes here and just show you one more thing before we finish this tutorial. So now we come back to the root page and we can see this is our table. We've got the URL of our QR code if we want to go and edit it. So I can go and change this title, a hamper, and hit save. Go back here. We can see that it's had one scan, and that is because I visited that URL. So if I go up here and go back again, if I do /scan again, this just simulates me scanning that QR code. If I come back here and refresh, it's now had 2 scans. I can create one more QR code. I'm going to say this product add hamper to cart. And again, I'm going to select the same product. And I'm going to say link to checkout page with products in the cart this time. I'm going to hit save. Now we've got a public one. So I'm going to go to public URL. And again, we've got a title and a QR code. And if I just go /scan, you'll see this time we end up in the cart with it there ready to purchase. So that's everything this app does. And that's having kind of created the remix tutorial. Now, of course, you can go in here and delete if you want to. And we go back here. And one other thing we'll do just to tidy up is we'll just delete this additional page. So if we go back to our code, we've got our app.additional. I'm just going to delete that. And then I'm going to go to app.jsx where we've got our nav menu, and I'm going to delete this secondary link. Now, if you're building this as a real app, you probably want to have a second page as some kind of like onboarding because Shopify like you to have that. So if I refresh this again now, you can see we no longer have this second page. And that's just an overview of the Shopify remix. There's obviously tons of stuff like webhooks and things you need in a real life application that I haven't took you through. But I hope this is enough to get you started in understanding what's going on. Remix is incredibly powerful. Things like the action and the loader functions are really useful. And actually having played around with this kind of demo that I've shown you, and I've also built my own Shopify app and I'm working on a second one. I really like Remix. I think it's really powerful. I think with this particular kind of boilerplate that Shopify provide, they've built in some really useful functionality. So having the database stuff built in straight away is really useful. The actual Shopify server it provides with the GraphQL, and being able to authenticate just builds in a ton of stuff out of the box. That means you don't need to worry about a lot of things. And then of course this webhooks page that we haven't really done anything with is really useful for responding to webhooks. And of course this webhooks functionality is kind of there as boilerplate for you to respond to webhooks as well. And if you're interested, I will actually make a second video on webhooks at some point and how to do them with Shopify, especially these 3 here, because these are the GDPR ones that are required if you create a Shopify app that's going to go live. But I hope you've enjoyed working through this tutorial with me. I hope you found it helpful and some of the explanations. If you've got any questions, do stick them below. Please subscribe to my channel, give this video a like if you found it helpful, and I'll see you guys again soon.